Chapter 13. The Trial. February 6th, 1980. In the Circuit Court of Cook County Criminal Division, the bailiff read, "The People of the State of Illinois versus John Wayne Gacy. Indictment number 76-69 to 79-75 and 79-2378 and 79-2378 to 792-403 before the Honorable Louis B. Garippo, Judge of said court and jury. The stage actors were Bernard Carey in the role of the State's Attorney of Cook County, William J. Kunkel, Robert R. Egan, Terry Sullivan, and James M. Varga, and the character roles of Assistant State's Attorneys of Cook County on behalf of the people. On behalf of the defendant, sharing leading roles, Sam L. Amirani and Robert M. Mata, attorneys. Judge Garippo greeted the jury, commended everyone for being on time, and the jury was sworn. I still felt that, technically, the jury should have been charged with perjury for lying under oath in Rockford and now in Chicago. I have no preconceived notions as to the guilt of the innocence of the defendant in this case, each juror had said. The day they were picked as jurors is the day they should have been sequestered. But Garippo allowed them the liberty to go home, to read their names in the newspapers, to study popular opinion and the media point of view, rehashings of historical mass murders, the psychology of clowns, references to homosexuality, to be influenced by people around them before coming to sit in unbiased judgment. At the point that a juror is picked, all outside pressure should be removed from him or her, not 6 days later. The damage had been done before the day they appeared in court for the trial. Any chance for unbiased judgment had been lost. The inexperience of my defense team had hurt in this as well as other respects. They should have insisted that the jurors be sequestered the day they were selected. By the time court convened, their minds were like subway walls trashed by scatological graffiti. Immediately after they were sworn, they were asked to leave the courtroom. A few pretrial matters had to be handled outside their presence. A witness was called to introduce 2 exhibits that the state wanted to use in its opening statement. Charles Pearson, an evidence technician with the sheriff's office, had prepared a large plat of the lot on Summerdale to be known as Exhibit Number 1. It was outrageous in size, 3.5 feet wide and 12 feet high. The second exhibit was a large Rand McNally map which portrayed the Chicago vicinity and the outlying 70-mile area. It had been marked with colored pens to highlight certain locations. They were to be admitted only for use as demonstrative evidence during opening arguments. However, because of their inexperience, my team members never had them removed. The prosecution was able to use them to hypnotize the jurors, and they were prejudicial against the defense. For 5.5 weeks, the jurors sat with those outsized pieces of state propaganda staring them in the face. Their size alone was intimidating and suggestive. They would be joined later by a gallery of 22 photos of victims dressed in Communion Day purity. The judge allowed those exhibits without restriction. Amirani stated, "Over our objection for the record." Garippo signaled the bailiff to bring the jury back. The opening statement for the people presented by Prosecutor Egan, was a long, rambling 39-page speech made up of fantasy and theory based on a scenario that he had conceived. He started with, "Picture, if you will," and presented hearsay statements which police officers attributed to me. Never once did he quote me in complete sentences. He edited what I had said, taking things out of context to serve his needs. He described a scene with the last victim, wrought of pure imagination, in an attempt to transport the jurors directly into a viewer's vantage point for the examination of a murder. Vincent Price stuff, but effective with a guileless audience. He told how the victim was a 15-year-old boy, working to get enough money for his first car at age 17, how a ghoulish contractor lured him from his job with the promise of a big salary, 4, 5, 6 times what he was earning, got him into his car, took him off into the distance. The court was totally remiss in not informing the jury that the scene set into their imaginations was no more than speculation on the part of the prosecution, no more than a hypothesis which should later be proven with evidence. My lips were sealed by protocol. I had to listen silently. I watched the jurors. They were wide-eyed, captivated. That kind of power fascinated and scared me. He created a murder for them, including dates, times, places, even down to the conversation, all lending believability, implying craftily that it would be substantiated and proved. It never was. The series of dates weren't fact, but merely guesses as to when the state felt each victim might have disappeared. They intermingled the terms disappeared and murdered throughout the trial as though they were synonymous. Not one of the dates was an actual murder date, according to what we had learned in our investigation, but that was withheld from the jurors. I suppose that most people who sit on a jury think that they are going to be hearing facts, at least from the state. They should be instructed that both opening and closing statements are not necessarily based on facts, that they may not contain any facts at all. But as jurors, they view the state as being representative of the system of justice, wholesome, honest, forthright. Jurors take an oath to keep an open mind, to listen to both sides impartially, to render a fair and honestly come-by verdict based on facts set before them. But I doubt that they sift through the state's testimony as suspiciously as they do that of the defense. I now know that both sides can be sidewinding liars, that a courtroom fight is just that, a fight. And sadly, in the courtroom as in a back alley, the purpose of a fight is victory. Win. Disregard truth and justice. There was to be no warning the first day or any other day. No ground rules were explained. The jurors were on their own, expecting veracity in those opening statements, the music of which set an unforgettable refrain. Mata objected after the first few minutes, but Judge Garippo would not honor the objection. Egan was to continue his fairy tale as if he had been a witness to what he was describing. Quoting Egan, trial transcript page 17, Gacy was getting into his car, and John Gacy motioned him into the car. He, pieced, said, "What do you want?" He said, "I want to talk to you about a job." John said, "How much time do you have? We could talk about it tonight." He thought, "Well, I want this job." He said, "Well, I got about 30 minutes. He said, Let's take a ride and talk about it. So he took a ride, and Gacy asked Peace, "Are you liberal?" He said, "Yeah, I'm liberal." He said, "Are you liberal about sex?" He said, "Well, I like to think I'm liberal about a lot of things." He said, "Did you ever have sex with a man?" He said, "No, I wouldn't do that." So they got to his house, and Peace went in, presumably thinking that he would be filling out an employment application. He went in the house, and Gacy said, "No, you can't have the job because you're not qualified for it. But how would you like to make fast $20? And Peace said, "What do you mean?" Gacy said, "I want you to come in and have sex with me." Not necessarily in those words. Peace said, "No, I wouldn't do that." Gacy said, "Well, that's all right. Let me show you some magic tricks. You see, I'm a clown." And he was, in fact, a clown. He said, "I know a lot of magic tricks. Let me show you one that I call a handcuff trick." And he handcuffed Peace behind his back, totally immobilizing his arms. He put Peace on the bed, and he pulled Peace's pants down, and he started orally copulating Robert Peace. But because he wasn't getting the response he wanted, you see, because Robert Peace wasn't frightened to tears, he was whimpering. That worried Gacy. He said, "I don't want him," he said to himself. Again, Mata objected. Not only what Egan was saying was highly prejudicial, but not one word of it was fact. But the jury was listening intently. The state, in its opening remarks, was supposed to inform the jury what it intended to present as evidence to use as proof, beyond a reasonable doubt, that only John Gacy could have committed the crimes. Nobody else. I could smell what was coming by what took place on that first day. Garippo was going to allow the state to do as it pleased, and the hell with the precepts and inherent decorum of the law. Egan, trial transcripts, pages 18 through 19. He, Gacy, said, "Don't cry. Don't cry. I want to show you one more trick. I call it the rope trick." He got behind Peace, and he took a rope and he put it behind Peace's neck, around his throat, and he tied a knot loosely, and he tied another knot. And Peace said, "Why are you putting a rope around my neck?" Gacy would later say, "Why did that kid ask me why I was putting a rope around his neck? He was stupid." Well, he put the rope around his neck, and Robert Peace soon found out why, because then he inserted a small piece of pipe in the rope. Do you know how a tourniquet works? Well, this worked the same way. He took the pipe and twisted it, and then he twisted it again, and he held it there, and it did just what a tourniquet would do. It broke off the blood flow to the brain, cracked the bone. No more air went to the lungs. Peace convulsed, and he was dead in seconds. You could hear a pin drop in the courtroom. Egan had held the jury spellbound. Moving on, he pointed to this horror board, Exhibit 1, and the smaller Exhibit number 2, his map. He hadn't mentioned them yet, so he then started indicating all the different places on the map, explaining its purpose for being in evidence. Here's Des Plains, which you passed on the way here today. And here's Park Ridge. You might have passed that coming into court today. It was now show and tell time. See, Park Ridge is a fact, and you can see it. Right here on the map. So everything I'm telling you is a fact. The Rockford people were so gullible, and Egan's acting was so good, they ate up every word. He told them that he wanted to go back 6 years, and for them to remember that I was charged with killing 33 people, that I started a murderous rampage in 1972. He planted bitter seeds. He said that what happened to Robert Peast was the same thing that happened to each and every one of the 33 boys and young men. He began to assume an omniscience. He talked as if he was a witness to everything he spoke about. Egan started with January 1972. The year a kid disappeared from a Greyhound bus station. He was now referred to as victim number 9 on the display map. The reason he was called Kid was that he was never identified. Egan resumed his hypnosis of the jury. His macabre tales were as merciless as they were grim. My perspective was how gruesomely absurd it all was. But the jury was watching, listening. He moved to July 31st, 1975, describing John Bukovich, then 18, who disappeared but came to rest under John Gacy's garage. That's all he could say. He could add nothing to point to me as his murderer. About 8 months passed, and one Darrell Sampson, 18, vanished in April of 1976. He was a runaway with serious teenage problems. Again, Egan used his pointer and his poster to show where Darrell was found. Egan then said that a month later, May 14th, 1976, a boy named Randall Reffitt, 15, went out to play and never came back. On the same day, Samuel Stapleton, 14, disappeared from the same neighborhood. The only data Egan had was that this boy worked in a pizza parlor and was saving for a car. But he talked about them as if he knew them personally. Did I fit into the murder of Samuel Stapleton? Egan never said. After he pointed to sites numbered 6 and 7, the graves of Reffitt and Stapleton, he moved on 3 weeks to June 3rd, 1976, to name the next victim, Michael Bonin, 17, who had left home to paint a friend's garage. He never got there. He associated me by the thinnest thread. I was in the remodeling and construction business with him. That was the sole link between myself and the number 18 his pointer rested on. We both used paint. Egan then moved to June 10th, 1976, as the day William Carroll, 16, vanished. He was a problem child, but was trying to get his act together by going to a special school. He never had the chance. He was number 22 on the plat, which Egan pointed to, now terming it Gacy's Graveyard. August 6th, 1976, and this time it was 18-year-old Rick Johnston, who lived in Bensonville, just west of O'Hare Airport. He had gone to a concert at Chicago's Aragon Ballroom, in one of the city's most dangerous areas. His mother had driven him and warned him of the neighborhood. Never was he heard from again. Egan listed him as victim number 23. pointed to the map, pointed to where Rick lived, and nodded. Many of the jurors nodded along. He pointed to the pad, number 23. All nodded along with him. He was pulling their strings. Up to that point, and mostly throughout the trial, they never placed me with any of the victims. The fact that I owned a house to which there were 12 keys in the hands of employees does not make me the person who killed them or who put their bodies under it. Egan went on with his scenario, moving forward 4 months to December 12th. The victim was Gregory Godzik, 17. Egan pointed out that he worked for me. This was half true. He worked for PDM, and I owned that. For the first time, Egan used some fact. On the night of December 12th, Gregory dropped off a date at 12:30 and never made it home. Egan went to the plat and pointed to number 4. More nodding. During the time Godzik worked for PDM, he showed up just 3 times in 6 days. When our investigators talked to his mother, they discovered that she had problems with him staying out all night and dabbling in drugs. Egan didn't bring up those facts. He didn't try to indicate what I had been doing that night. Nothing to associate us on that evening. The prosecutor theorized that after the boys' date, he had gone to 8213 Summerdale. To meet whom? The people who worked for me were certainly more his age. We shared no interests. No. The state's prosecutors were selling air to the Rockford Provincial. Egan pointed out that 8 people had been buried at the Summerdale address. He didn't know where they had been killed. No trace of proof of how, why, or by whom. He implied since I owned that piece of property, I had to know what was happening there. Preposterous. On January 20th, 1977, John Zick disappeared. At least he was reported missing on that day. Maybe. Or maybe that was supposed to be the last day he was seen by family or friends. Which was it? Egan didn't know. He didn't link Zick to me. March 15th, 1977. Victim number 1 on Egan's chart was John Prestige, 20, visiting from Kalamazoo, Michigan. He was staying with a friend on Chicago's north side. All that seems to be known is that he inquired of his friend about Bughouse Square, a sleazy, gay-ridden, drug-ridden section on the near north side. His friend advised him not to go roaming around that area. He left his friend that night and was never seen again. Then Egan told the jurors that spring turned to summer. Well, he got that right, and the provincials were nodding with him again. And if that was right, then they had to believe that everything else Egan said was right. July 5th, 1977. Matthew Bowman, 19. Body number 8. That date was used because he happened to appear in traffic court that day, visited with his sister, and never showed up again. Robert Gilroy was body number 25. Egan gave no date for his disappearance. Why, I don't know. None of the dates had any specific meaning. He just tells us what he has. He just tells us that he was 18 and that he went out hitchhiking on some horse stable. That was the last he was heard of. September 25th, 1977. John Mowry, 19, an ex-Marine, worked at a Chicago bank. He had dinner with his folks that day and told his parents that he was feeling depressed. They asked him to stay overnight with them, but he declined. He was not heard from again. Egan next mentioned October 17th, 1977, and the name of Russell Nelson, 21, from Minnesota, who was staying with friends. I'm sure that meant staying. On that date, he left for Chicago's Broadway and Belmont area, a notorious gay center, saying he was going discoing. He never came back. Egan failed to give a body number or say if he was on the graveyard plat. Egan continued the ghastly roll call, giving the date of November 11th, 1977. Another Michigan boy, Robert Winch, a 16-year-old runaway. Egan gave him number 11 on the graveyard, tapping the large plat with his pointer. November 18th, 1977 is Egan's next date. Tommy Bowling, married, 1 child, unemployed body and fender man. He was last heard from by his mother, with whom he discussed some business by telephone from a bar. Egan moved to 3 weeks later. David Talsma, 19, was in the Marine Reserves and lived with his parents. No date of disappearance was given. He went to a rock concert and didn't return. He was given no plot number in Gacy's graveyard. Egan had, by that time, spoken briefly of 17 dead boys. 17 boys whom he said I murdered and buried beneath my house. 1978. Gacy's last year of killing. February 16th. A boy named William Kindred, 19, was from the north side. He saw his girlfriend every single day. So the first day she didn't see him, she knew something was amiss. That night, he told his roommate he was going to a bar. He wasn't heard from again until he turned up as body number 27. We moved from February to summer, June 30th, 1978. According to Egan, the crawl space was filling up. Timothy O'Rourke was found in the Des Plaines River. Egan linked us by saying that O'Rourke told his roommates that he had met a construction man in the suburbs. One evening he went out for cigarettes and ended up in that river. That's how Egan put it. That's it. That was the whole link. November 4th, 1978. Frank Landigan, 19, had a fight with his girlfriend. He had been in jail and had been bonded out. He was last seen walking down Foster Avenue and was in the Des Plaines River. Egan made it a point to tell the jury that his bond receipt was found at the Summerdale house. That may have been so. I fixed many tickets for employees and their friends. There are a number of ways it could have ended up there. I was a precinct captain, and it was not unusual for me to have those things, but it certainly didn't put him with me. Or the slip could have come in via one of my young employees who wanted a favor done for a friend. Many times, bond slips and driver's licenses were left in the office when I was out of town. 3 weeks later, Thanksgiving Day, 1978. James Mazzara, 21, from Elmwood Park, had Thanksgiving dinner with his folks. When he returned to the apartment, which he shared with some friends in downtown Chicago, close to Bughouse Square, he found that they had been evicted. James was last seen by a friend walking down the street with a suitcase. He was found floating in the Des Plaines River. Egan then mentioned Robert Peast again as being the last victim. He had talked about 22 whom he had identified, and went on to say that 11 more had not been identified, but were found in the Summerdale graveyard. Egan then told the jury how the men of the Des Plaines Police Department had discovered the bodies, without saying that the search had been made with illegal search warrants. He claimed to have 5 unsigned statements from me. I asked myself if the jurors would wonder why, if I had indeed made those statements, if I had gone so far as to confess murder, why I hadn't signed them. Could they figure out that those were not my statements, but statements written by the police? At no time during those so-called interviews did those officers write down what I had been saying, even while I was high on drugs. The only statement I gave them I signed. The other 4 are what the police made up for the record, written to clear up a historic case. My signature would have been so convenient, saving them from doing any work on this most difficult case. But my signature was missing, as was the truth when Egan told the jurors that the police knew about the case because I had told them. He turned back to the jurors, saying, "We will prove to you that John Gacy killed 33 people, and we will prove to you that John Gacy murdered 33 boys because his actions were those of a thoughtful, rational, premeditated, evil man." If he was so sure of himself, why was he so quick to go for Emirani's insanity defense? Because he knew that once Emirani agreed to that, he didn't have to prove a thing, and he knew he couldn't. Emirani handed me over to them, sold me out. With the insanity defense, he stipulated that I committed the crimes, claiming that I was insane at the time. So now there was to be no murder trial. There was to be an insanity trial. The state didn't have to prove a thing. All they had to do was put enough doctors on the stand to confuse the issues, and the jurors in their confusion would do the rest. The police would have the big crime of the century solved without it ever being proven that I was the only possible person who could have committed it. The greatest murder cover-up of the century. Watch the trial unfold and arrive at your own conclusion. Egan said he would show 10 factors common to all the murders. 1. They were all boys, no females. I guess you couldn't argue with the medical examiner on that one. 2. They were all involved with some talk of monies. Omniscience again. He heard every word, but he never tried to prove it. 3. They all came in his car to his home after being picked up somehow. That was never proven. But if it had been true, why did the state confiscate 2 trucks from PDM? 4. Until early in 1978, when he ran out of room, all of them were buried on his property, most of them in the safety of his own home, surrounded by nothing but cement walls. And there's no windows here. Nobody can look in there. Planned and premeditated. While it's a fact that the bodies were found there, it doesn't prove that I'm the person who put them there. 5. All the other bodies were dumped in the same river at the same spot. Does that prove that I threw the bodies in that river? 6. Each boy killed the same way, the rope trick, the rope around the neck, the knot, the other knot, the item, the twist, the tourniquet, each the same way, planned, mechanical, and premeditated. That's not what Dr. Stein, head medical examiner for Cook County, said, nor the medical examiners who checked the bodies from the river. Dr. Robert Stein said 6 were by ligature strangulation, 1 by stabbing, 1 by manual strangulation, 13 by suffocation, meaning buried alive, 10 undetermined. The forensic pathologist stated that the other 2 found in the river were atraumatic, meaning that there was no evidence of an injury having caused death before entering the water. But the state wanted to establish a pattern for the jurors' imaginations. 7. That most of the clothing of the victims was disposed of. Probably true, but of no value in identifying the murderer. 8. Egan claimed that I kept souvenirs, driver's license, ring, fishing license, and Robert Peast's coat were found at the Summerdale house. But Robert Peast wasn't found at the house. Those items could have been dumped off at the house at any time. They don't prove that he was in the house or that I had ever seen him. 9. Many of the bodies that were recovered either had a cloth-like material stuffed in their mouths or a plastic bag over their heads. Several of them still had the rope trick around their necks. Planned and premeditated. But again, that didn't prove who killed them. It didn't prove any association with me. 10. Finally, Egan claimed that he had asked me why the murders were committed in various ways, and that I had talked with him about that. That's not true. I had seen Egan for the first time at the arraignment and never talked with him. But how were the jurors to find that out when Amirani stipulated, conceded everything the state maintained? Everything. Egan ended the long opening statement with, "If there is another man more evil than John Gacy among us, God help us all." Pure drama. After breaking for lunch, it was Robert Motta's turn to make our opening statement. A chance for total refutation. I wondered from the beginning when he would start attacking Egan's remarks. It wouldn't happen. Instead, he talked about death being death, and that revenge couldn't bring the victims back. That the jurors should forget about anger or sympathy or vengeance, and that they should leave their prejudices and preconceived notions out of the courtroom. That they should base their deliberations on the issues presented to them during the trial. At this very beginning, he was laying the groundwork, not for my innocence, but for the insanity defense. He merely summarized what Egan had said, only attacking Egan's conclusion of premeditation. Trial transcripts, pages 58 to 60. The state has gone through a rather lengthy explanation as to each of the 33 bodies that were recovered. They said that because they were buried in the house in a certain fashion, that shows premeditation. But if you look at the evidence and consider that this is a house, I want to take you back a few years too. You put yourself in that house and you try to conceive of living there with 29 bodies, 28 under it and 1 in the garage. Try and determine whether or not, with your common sense, avoiding all of the psychiatric testimony, just with your common sense, whether that evidence that the state will introduce bespeaks of a sound mind. Consider further that this was done over and over and over again in the same manner. Is this premeditation, or is it obsession? Is it compulsion? Is it the device of a deeply sick individual? Certainly there is a pattern, but it doesn't show premeditation. It shows a profound, incredible obsession. 30-inch crawl space. The evidence will show that these bodies were taken down there. You can't stand up down there. You have got to dig with your hands, over and over and over again. Sure, Mr. Gacy collected souvenirs. He collected bodies. These facts will show you. A collector of bodies. What made him do it is something that we will demonstrate to you. The question, why, is the most important question, because in order for you to reach a decision based on sound judgment, a decision based not on prejudice, not on anger, not for a desire for revenge or vengeance, but a decision based on common sense, looking at the entire picture and then coming to a conclusion. Mata went over and over the state's case, but instead of ripping it apart, he was filling in blanks that Egan left open. That's why I felt it was an extension of the state's case. There I sat, wondering to myself, what happened to the three-pronged defense Amirani had sold me on? Why weren't we taking on the state's case and punching holes in it? Where is the part about the state's not being able to prove that John Gacy is the only man who could have committed the crimes? I was getting madder by the minute. I had already had my fill of special terms as abnormal, deeply sick individual, compulsion, collector of bodies, obsession, evil, deranged, raging maniac, insanity, mental disease, neurotic symptoms, sexual deviant, compulsive obsessive, pseudo-neurotic, schizophrenic. I didn't like it at all. What had Amirani and Mata gotten me bogged down into? Then Mata told the jury that he would explain what the evidence showed. I figured that was where he would attack the state's case. But no, I was wrong again. He started forecasting what the doctors would be saying, concluding, the evidence will show that John Gacy is insane under any standards, whether it be the standard of your own good conscience or your common sense. I had followed Amirani's instructions. I was to sit there and let the jurors see me as being completely uninterested in what was being said or going on. But how could I sit there and listen to Mata tear me apart, especially after Egan had dragged me through the mud? I expected Egan to make a monster of me. Mata, on the other hand, was the first supposed to take the state's case apart, then raise the insanity issue if all else failed. That's how I interpreted our case. But Mata would only talk about the different doctors who would tell the jury about all my mental problems, about the numerous labels that would apply to me. He even had me stand up like a dummy and look bland for the jury, wordlessly. Not even a speaking part in this theater of the absurd. I saw it was all going haywire. I was being set up. The opening statements were finished, and Judge Garippo gave instructions to the jurors. During the evening, again, do not discuss this case in any way. You haven't heard any evidence, and it would not be fair to either side to begin your discussion at any time before you have heard all the evidence and also received your instructions. During the time that you are sequestered, perhaps people, curiosity-wise, might attempt to talk to you and find out how things are going and things like that. Remember them. Remind them of your oath not to discuss the case in any way, and also remind them of the possibility of their being subject to criminal penalties, either for contempt or for criminal penalties for attempting to discuss this case in any way with you. Again, it may be a tempting thing for these people whom you might legitimately have contact with to make some sort of inquiry along those lines. But please refrain from doing so. 100 witnesses. The first series of witnesses brought in by the state were called life and death witnesses. To prove that someone has died, it must be first proven that someone lived. So family members were called to verify the existence and the residence of the identified victims, usually by photographs or by personal possessions. The jurors were never told that only 6 of the victims were properly identified, and 16 were only tentatively identified as the persons the state claimed they were. The first witness was Marko Bukovic, the father of John Bukovic. He had last seen his son on July 29, 1979, and reported him missing on July 31st. John had worked for PDM ever since the fall of 1974, and told his father he would go by my office to pick up a paycheck before staying all night with a friend. Egan, after showing the father an 8x10 picture of his son, mounted the photo on the 4-foot by 12-foot display board, facing the jurors with slots for another 21 pictures of the same size. The state withheld pertinent information, but had the witness tell how he had given the boy his own apartment and that I had helped John remodel it. That left the image of loving and caring parents and a good kid. Mata failed to bring out that later the two had arguments about John quitting school and getting into drugs and grass, whereupon the father kicked him out of the apartment as punishment, and the boy threatened to run away from home. When he came after his paycheck for $130, I wouldn't give it to him, because he owed PDM $325 for carpeting we had put in his apartment, and his father wouldn't let him take it back. So much for the loving father image. Another thing our investigation turned up was that, after leaving PDM that night with 3 friends, they went to a pool hall, got into a fight, and beat up a man with a pool cue. All this some 3 hours after seeing me. This information would have punctured the state's case that the crime was sexually motivated. The defense did not carry out its responsibility. The next witness, called Dolores Vance, mother of Daryl Sampson, who was last seen alive on April 6, 1976, and reported to the police as missing. Again, the prosecution painted a characterization of a pristine young man. The state wanted all the victims to appear as altar boys, and me as the devil. Amirani didn't bring out anything about the results of our investigation, which turned up the boy's police record as a street hustler and how many times he had run away from home. If we had brought out any of our negative information, it would have meant evoking anger and distaste in the jury. The state had only built-in advantage. They came across as commiserative and sensitive. We could only appear at that point as callous predators, violating the memories of the dead. Their plan was cold and clean, but a far cry from factual. Life and death witnesses are not the ones to get evidence from. But at some point we should have cleared up the picture the jurors got from the state's attorneys. Members of only about 5 of the concerned families were willing to testify at the trial, and most who came forth did so only under subpoena. No one was willing to assert that most of the victims did not live wholesome lives, but the truth remains that most of those murdered boys did lead lives away from home that were dishonorable. For the most part, their lives comprised numerous runaways, juvenile records, male prostitution, strong homosexual histories. Everyone has some dirt under his fingernails. While theirs was being covered up, the state was magnifying mine. But it couldn't connect me with any one of those deaths, other than that the bodies had been found on the property that I owned. The next witness was Miss Bessie Stapleton, mother of Samuel Stapleton, 14, who disappeared on May 13th, 1976. Now watch, if you will, a pre-planned rehearsed dialogue, a sad performance where a bereaved was told to emote for the jury. Did your son wear any particular type of jewelry? Yes, he wore a bracelet, a chain bracelet. What type of chain was that? Like a dark chain? I ask you, Miss Stapleton, to examine the contents of an envelope labeled People's Exhibit Number 8. That's Sam's bracelet. God. Why? The trial was halted, and Mrs. Stapleton was taken off the stand. 3 other witnesses testified before they brought her back to identify her son's dental records. Garippo had her brought back to the stand while the jury was out of the room, sensing what the prosecution had planned. He had the state show her a photo of her son, which would go on their display board. Egan said, "This is the same photo I showed you in the office this morning." And she identified it without emotion. When the jury had returned to the courtroom, she identified the photo and the dental records. And Moraney cross-examined. He asked if she knew or had heard about men named Ronald Duncan and David Cook. The first she wasn't sure about. The second she said yes. Sam asked her what she told the police about that person. I can't recall. I can't remember. This was the first link in a chain of memory losses throughout the trial. Always coming at critical moments, always when evasion was necessary. How about Tommy Bowley? Do you know a girl by the name of Christy McPeak? Did you hear of a person named Mr. Clean? Yes. Egan objected. Judge Garippo sustained it. Sam had hit a nerve. It showed in her face, and it ruffled Egan. And Moraney asked another question about Mr. Clean. Egan objected. Hearsay. Mrs. Stapleton parroted. Just hearsay. The reason she didn't want to answer was that Mr. Clean, David Cook, and Tommy Bowling were all street hustlers and druggers with arrest records. They were also her son's friends. This was all learned through our investigation. And Moraney returned to the bracelet over which she had played her emotional scene earlier. That bracelet you saw before, Mrs. Stapleton. Did you see that before you came in the courtroom here? That's my son's bracelet. Did you see that bracelet today before you came in the courtroom? Yes. Was that the first time you saw it? No. When was the last time you saw it? I've seen it before. And you did see it today, again, Right before you came into court?
Yes.
Do you know who showed you that bracelet?
My attorney.
Mr. Egan?
Yes.
Some of the jurors mumbled to each other. As late as August 27th, 1976, didn't people tell you they had seen your son?
Egan jumped.
Objection.
Sustained.
The people Amirani asked her about, Cook, McPeak, Mr. Clean, all said they had seen her son after the date on which the state claimed I had killed him. They didn't want that fact disclosed. I couldn't understand why. With all the information they had, Amirani and Mata didn't go right into poking holes in the state's case. Certainly this was the time to do that if they were working for a directed verdict of acquittal. Already the state's case was vulnerable, but it didn't fit into Sam's scheme of an insanity defense. That's all he could see. Or else that was part of an agreement he had made with elements who were adverse to my case. All the state had evinced so far with their life and death witnesses was that the victims were born, they lived, some went to the dentist, and that maybe they were killed, but on the dates they were last seen. It was shown that bodies had been found under the house, but there was no mention of the 12 keys to the house and the hands of others. The case against me was shabby from day one. No effort had been made, nor would be made, to put me with any one of them. When the trial was over, the families of those boys still did not know who had killed them. And I'm on death row, because my attorneys tried to pass me off as insane and a pretense to having my life spared. One of the 3 witnesses who took the stand between Stapleton's first and second appearances was Myrtle Reffitt, the mother of Randall Reffitt, age 15. He was last seen by his mother when he left her house on May 14th, 1976, and was found by the excavators in the crawl space under the Summerdale house. He was never shown to be connected with me at any time, in any way. Since I didn't know him, I have to suppose that he may have known one of the employees who had keys to the house. His mother identified his picture before it was passed among the jurors for viewing before being added to the state's display. The next witness was Mrs. Shirley Stein. Her son, Michael Bonin, who lived at home with her, disappeared on June 3rd, 1976, after leaving the house to go on a painting job with a friend. On June 9th, she reported him missing. On December 30th, 1978, the police informed her that they had found his fishing license at the Summerdale house. She was shown a picture which she identified as her son. No link was made between me and Michael. The state next called Esther Johnson to the stand. She had driven her son Rick to Chicago's Aragon Ballroom on the night of August 6, 1976, for a rock concert. She waited until it was over so she could take him home, but she never saw him again. She reported him missing the following day. State's Attorney Sullivan did his best to elicit long narrative answers from her, a ploy to emotionalize the jurors. Objections by my attorneys were flying when the answers began. She thought he might have run away to join the Moonies. Sullivan was guiding her as much as possible, even to the point of putting words in her mouth. He ended up by having her identify a picture of her son, which became exhibit number 14. I didn't know the boy, and still, and no evidence showed we had ever met. After a lunch recess, Mrs. Eugenia Godzik testified. Kunkel had her say that her son, Gregory, was working at Republic Lumber for $2.35 an hour and quit that job to work for PDM for $5.50. I guess that figure was decided on to match up with the Robert Peast story, wherein they claimed that I offered $5.50 to work for me. Actually, Gregory started at $3. She testified that he worked for me for 2 weeks and started a third. Yet, the business records show that he started on a Thursday afternoon, worked through Saturday, didn't show up Monday or Tuesday, worked Wednesday and part of Thursday, Friday, and never called or came in again. She claimed that she had talked to me only once, that being after the boy had disappeared. That was false. When he didn't show up that Monday, I called his home and talked with his mother, saying that the least he could have done was to call me so that the other guys wouldn't have to sit around waiting for him. She told me that he spoke highly of me, and she hoped that I wouldn't fire him for not showing up. She would talk to him. She confided that she was having trouble with him staying out late, hanging around with the wrong people. Someone had even tried to kick his head in, which I knew because I had seen the bandage. She felt that since he looked up to me, maybe I could have a talk with him to help her. I said I would. How do you tell a mother that her son is dealing? He had bought drugs onto the job and was selling some to my other employees. Altogether, his life was disorderly. My point is that his interests were common to other employees closer to his age, rather than to me. She told Kunkel that she had talked to me several days after Gregory disappeared and found out that I had a tape recording of her son's voice, which I destroyed. That was partly true. He called and left a message on my answering machine, but that machine had a capacity of 25 messages, and his message was automatically erased when the 26th call came in. I don't know what the state was trying to prove by the allegation that I destroyed it. Kunkel decided that Mrs. Godzik identification of the boy's picture had been too emotional and called a sister, Eugenia, to the stand to identify it. Then he called Judy Patterson, Gregory's girlfriend, who was the last person to see him alive, December 12th, 1976. Mata moved to have the Godzik testimony stricken as cumulative, but Garippo allowed the witness to continue. Patterson claimed that she came to see me a few days after Gregory disappeared. The fact is that it was 2 months later, in February. Her car broke down in the neighborhood, and she was in a tow truck with a couple of her girlfriends. She said she had stopped by several times previously, but didn't catch me at home. Her testimony was full of falsehoods. That Greg told me he intended to run away. That I asked to beat up on Greg so bad that he had to have stitches in his forehead. That I said I was in the crime syndicate and we would go after the guy. The girl had a great imagination, but, again, I don't know what they were trying to prove. Kunkel showed her the picture of Godzik, and she identified him. Mrs. Violet Carroll was the next witness. She was the mother of William Carroll, 16. He was reported missing June 14th, 1976. Her son lived with her, and she had last seen him about midnight the night before, and had given dental records to the sheriff's office. She looked at the state's photo, number 16, and identified it as her son. Emma Ranney brought out, in cross-examination, as with previous witnesses, the physical description of the victim.
The Carroll boy was muscular because he did a lot of weightlifting. His mother told the jury that he had been reported missing several times previously. Then Emirani asked about the kind of people he ran around with, but the state objected to that line of questioning. Mrs. Carroll was ready to answer, but was stopped. The state did not connect me with William Carroll in any way. In one of the many recesses, I asked my attorneys why they weren't bringing out more information about the victims' backgrounds. Emirani said it wasn't important. They said they knew that Carroll and many of the other victims were street hustlers, but claimed that Garippa would not allow any of that kind of information to go to the jurors, he said. Don't worry. Mrs. Rosemary Zick was next called to the stand. She was the mother of John Allen Zick, reported missing January 21st, 1977. During Sullivan's direct examination, Mrs. Zick said that her son had been living with his girlfriend in an apartment in Chicago, and when he disappeared, he owned a 1971 white Plymouth Satellite. Sullivan showed her Exhibit 17, which she identified as the car's registration. It had been found in his own apartment. She testified that he was last seen alive when he left work January 20th and was reported missing the following day.